The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. U.S. President George Washington, 1796.
World War II is over. The Treaty of Paris has been signed, and the National Union and the Third Reich are the dominant forces on the globe. The CSA no longer exists. Neither does Canada. The remnants of the Soviet government now govern the rest of Russia from Omsk, behind the Urals. Japan is under strict American occupation. Britain remains independent, but also isolated. Most of mainland Europe has fallen under the iron fist of the Nazis. North America has also fallen to a new authoritarian anti-democratic dictatorship, and China is expanding its influence in East Asia. The world had changed dramatically, and not for the better. Now that the war had ended, the National Union set to work purging and eliminating various racial, religious, and regional groups. The Germans did the same, however much more viciously. The first 3 or so years after the war would later be nicknamed the honeymoon period between the NUA and the German Reich, when relations between the two empires were seemingly peaceful. This peace fizzled out very quickly. In Britain, the country was in shambles. The economy had hit the floor, and the government knew that if they were to survive, they needed trading partners. The NUA had ambitions to turn the UK into a loyal ally after the war. The Reich, meanwhile, wanted Britain to be economically and politically subjugated to them. These conflicting ambitions sparked a tension between the Germans and the Americans in 1948. In June of 1949, the German Navy began to enter British waters off the coast of Cornwall. The Royal Navy was quick to respond, and there was a standoff between the two countries, sparking the Channel Crisis. President Pele immediately called for the Germans to retreat, threatening to declare war, and so they reluctantly did. This event would mark the beginning of the Cold War between America and Germany. After the Channel Crisis, the NUA severely distrusted the Reich. In 1951, the Coalition of Oceanic Nations was founded between the National Union and its territories and puppets, as well as Ireland, Panama, Nicaragua, and eventually Japan, who gained independence as an American puppet. The UK eventually got twisted into joining the group in 1954. In response to this, the Germans founded the Greater Germanic Bloc, which encompassed them, their Reichskommissariats, France, Hungary, and Romania. Finland and Bulgaria would eventually join in later. In the eyes of the Americans, it was as if a steel curtain had just fallen over the channel. On top of all this, a nuclear arms race began between the NUA and the GGR, and in no time, both nations had ambitions of reaching space. In 1954, the Germans launched their Reich satellite, the world's first satellite. They also sent the first man into space by 1958. The German space program was far more advanced than the Americans, and the NUA fell behind quickly. Also, with the discovery of oil on the Arabian Peninsula, both the Germans and Americans became really chummy with the Arab states. Meanwhile, the Italian Empire had become a joke. They had a bad economy, and their army was too small and ineffective to run their large Mediterranean empire. Very soon, they began to lose grip. In 1955, Yugoslavia rebelled, and Italy's North African territories would follow suit. The NUA wasn't hesitant to support these rebellions, however the Germans were having none of it. In 1957, the German army crossed the Italian border and launched their invasion. Italy was crushed within a matter of months. The Germans then founded a puppet state called the National Italian Republic. Italy, and its Balkan puppets and some of its North African territories were all absorbed into the GGB. Sudan and Ethiopia, meanwhile, simply crumbled into a series of warlord factions. This made Pele and the NUA look bad, resulting in a rise in press and media censorship. Internally, the NUA wasn't doing so well. Due to their oppressive governing nature, resistance sprung up all across the country. In 1955, a new political party in the South had been founded, calling themselves the Dixiecrats, with their first leader being Strom Thurmond. The radicals in the party wanted to regain Confederate independence, while the moderates just wanted autonomy. The NUA, being a one-party state, couldn't tolerate the group, so the government made the party illegal, causing them to go under. In 1958, Strom Thurmond was mysteriously killed in a bus accident. The Dixiecrats obviously blamed the Legion and started their own militia. Over the following decade, they carried out several terrorist attacks on government buildings. In Canada, an underground secret resistance group was formed, simply called the Hunters. They were mostly stationed in the north and occasionally bombed American supply trains to Canada. Later, they moved on to destroying cargo vessels and writing anti-government messages in public places. The National Union's police force struggled to control the group since they would always go into hiding after every attack. It's also worth pointing out that China had strong ambitions to make a name for themselves. They allied with Germany and then founded the Asian Unity Pact in 1959, consisting of them, Korea, Mongolia, Myanmar, and Tibet. China also began funding independence movements in Central Asia against the still isolated SSSR. They also allied themselves with India, and Chiang Kai-shek was granted the Chinese presidency for life. The Anyway perceived all of this as a threat, ushering in a rise in racist anti-Chinese propaganda. America's concerns had to turn away from East Asian geopolitics, however. In 1963, a German space vessel, known as the Mondshift 1, made contact with the moon's surface. Out of the ship came German astronaut Friedrich Müller, who set foot and planted the flag of the German Reich. The Germans had officially won the moon race. Though historical accounts vary, it's said that upon hearing the news, Supreme President Pelé was so infuriated that he had a stroke. He survived, however, was severely mentally and physically affected ever since. In 1964, Adolf Hitler died at the age of 75. After a messy process, Hermann Göring succeeded him as the new German Führer. Members of the Nazi SS weren't too happy about this succession, and in October, they took control of a nuclear base in Ouatan, France. Once they took it, the SS threatened to launch nukes towards Germany, the UK, and the NUA, beginning the Ouatan Missile Crisis. A series of international negotiations had to be initiated in order for the crisis to be averted, and in the end, it was decided that, under Göring, the SS would be given more autonomy. An autonomous SS state in northern Burgundy was also proposed, but the plan didn't go through. 1965 marked the 100-year anniversary of the US surrender to the Confederacy, and so anyway President William Pelé, despite his deteriorating health, made a speech in Washington, D.C.
100 years ago today, United States President McClellan, in an act of cowardice, demanded a northern surrender to the southern traitors. 92 years ago in this very city, President Charles Sumner declared a second war against the Confederate States, hoping to bring them down. He failed. However, his efforts were not in vain. Sumner and every other Union soldier can rest easy, knowing that their mission was completed. I completed it. The National Union has completed it. America has gone back to its place in the sky. NUA Supreme President William Dudley Pelé, 1965.
The Dixiecrats in the South weren't too happy about the speech, and open rioting began. Pelé, however, sent the military to crush these riots, and soon the states of Louisiana and Georgia were placed under martial law. Pelé, due to old age and weakness, died only 3 months after this. The government then had to decide who would become the next dictator of the NUA. After some infighting, they settled on George Lincoln Rockwell, a rising figure within the Silver Legion Party. Rockwell initially aimed to simmer down the tense relations between the NUA and the German Reich, eventually meeting up with Hermann Göring in Nuremberg in 1966. However, he was also very protective of the American image, and in 1967, Guatemala joined the coalition of oceanic nations, and during the late 60s, the NUA's nuclear arsenal was greatly expanded. Speaking of nukes, China and India managed to test their own in 1968. Rumors also began to circulate that the SSSR was also building and testing nukes, leading to increased German and American militarization in the Urals and the Bering Strait. From 1969, a period of relative peace known as détente began between the Reich, the Chinese, and the National Union. In 1970, the NUA also managed to land their Ares spacecraft on the moon, finally getting an American on the surface. The 1970s, however, would not be a good decade for either side of the Steel Curtain. By 1971, the British began to grow tired of being pushed around by the Americans, and the new British Prime Minister, Edward Heath, began calling for the UK to leave the American-led CON, nicknaming the idea Brexit. By this time, an anti-American organization, known as the Children of the Jack, was formed in the UK and began holding demonstrations against the American Legionary Army. The group's efforts didn't go beyond demonstrations until 1972, when a militant faction within the COTJ carried out a bombing attack on the NUA embassy in London. Supreme President Rockwell immediately demanded the UK government to arrest the group. However, things got much worse. In December of 1973, an American cargo ship, carrying mostly tea, coffee, and sugar, exploded in Liverpool Harbour. The CO2J immediately claimed responsibility. The Americans had had it. In January of 74, the Legionary Army made landings and occupied the city of Liverpool. Britain left the CON shortly after. In the Reich, Hermann Göring was assassinated in 1975. What ensued was a power struggle in the government that ended catastrophically. In early 1976, a German civil war was declared between people who supported Karl Donetsk becoming the next Führer and people who supported Rudolf Hess. The SS also took part as a third faction in the war. During the war, various North African states, in which anti-German sentiments had already been forming, left the Greater Germanic Bloc, and in turn the Reich. The Germans could do very little to stop this. In 1978, the GGB as a whole was disbanded. This was shortly followed by a revolution in France, which toppled the German puppet government. Similar revolutions also happened in the Balkans, and soon Greece saw a return of the old monarchist government, and the German African territories launched a guerrilla war against their occupiers. The war in Germany quickly became ugly, and both sides threatened to launch nuclear weapons on each other. Meanwhile, as more and more troops were being pulled out of the Reichskommissariats to fight in Germany, the Triple SR managed to finally come out of their shell, invading Moscow in 1979. The SS also fell in that same year. In 1980, Karl Donetsk died, and his supporting army, which was already being defeated, lost most of their will to fight and surrendered to Hess in October, ending the Civil War. Once in power, Rudolf Hess realized that Germany's position in Europe had been permanently shattered, with France, Greece, Yugoslavia, and the North African states all independent, and the Siberian Red Army crushing the remnants of the German army in Muscovine. In December, he declared the Third Reich officially dissolved and the foundation of the national state of Germany, ending the Cold War. It would be a stretch, however, to say that the Cold War had ended in an American victory, though. At the dawn of the decade, the NUA had been experiencing a rising amount of internal issues. A new resistance group was founded in Arkansas in 1970 called the Black American Alliance, or BMA, inspired by the teachings of the long-dead preacher Martin Luther King Jr. There were also small-scale resistance fighters in the northern Mexican states, calling themselves the Spanish Front. President Rockwell demanded an immediate crackdown on these groups. However, he failed to realize that by the 1970s, most of the resistance groups in America managed to militarize significantly. Rockwell died of lung cancer in 1977, and the government struggled to figure out a new leader, so they simply placed the entire Union under martial law. For the following 3 years, the American people had no clue who was actually running the country, as the government continued to hide the fact that the Union was rotting. This all boiled over in 1980, when the South rebelled and declared a revolution led by the Dixiecrats. Various Mexican and Canadian groups also revolted. The scale of these rebellions were far too big for the Legionary Army to handle at once, and a civil war was declared. This war would be known simply as the Great American War. Due to the low concentration of troops in the Arctic regions, the Canadian rebels spread quickly. With all the attention being focused on the mainland, the NUA's Atlantic islands broke away with minimal resistance. Meanwhile in Britain, with more troops leaving Liverpool, the UK declared war on the NUA, pushing the Legionary Army out of Liverpool and finally ending their 5-year-long occupation. In the south, the rebels fought ferociously against the Legionists, using guerrilla warfare to gradually weaken their resolve. These weaknesses allowed various Pacific states to declare rebellion as well. In Mexico, a coup took place in 1982, dismantling the pro-American government. A similar thing happened in Japan. Upon declaring independence, the Mexicans immediately rushed to the aid of the Latin American insurgents. Texas and New England also took the chance to rebel in this war. The Legionary Army was overwhelmed. The CON had to be disbanded, and by 1983, the government knew that they were done for. The military launched a coup, and the National Union of America was officially dissolved in November. Immediately after the declaration, the Dixiecrats and the other Southern rebels declared the restoration of the Confederate States of America, though it was much smaller than it was pre-World War II, housing only 14 states. Mexico annexed a bit of territory, however the states along the Rio Grande and the Yucatan managed to remain independent. The Caribbean islands also broke away and formed the Caribbean Union. Texas, New England, Arizona, Deseret, Colorado, Cascadia, Kansas, Alaska, Hawaii, Quebec, Canada, and eventually the Great Lakes region all declared independence between 1983 and 1985. The remaining states on the West Coast also formed the Pacific States of America. In the remaining territories in the center of America, various Native American tribes had banded together to form the country of Lakota. The only thing left of the National Union was Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and western New York, where the Silver Legion had set up a military dictatorship, renaming themselves to the American Union. Over a span of 5 years, both fascist powers had imploded, and thus their grip on the world went with them. Now that the Cold War was over, Reconstruction had to begin. In the CS and the PS, the governments had to establish constitutions. The CS settled on bringing back their pre-World War II one, and the first CS election after the war took place, with the Dixiecrat George Wallace defeating Al Gore, becoming the first president of the Second Confederacy. The PSA had their first election in 1985, and Ronald Reagan became the first PS president. Eastern Europe, meanwhile, was in tatters. The former Reichskommissariats were extremely poor, but there was something even worse that the new countries had to deal with. Across Poland and Ukraine, a chain of concentration camps had been uncovered, and the contents were horrifying. To put it simply, the Germans had been butchering Slavic and Jewish people in the millions. The German government, to this day, still hasn't acknowledged this, let alone apologized. In 1986, the International Union was founded between the nations of the globe to make sure that the horrors of the Second World War and the Cold War were never repeated. Also, the Wallace administration in the CS had proven to be a disaster. Nothing was done, and in the end, the Dixiecrats' agenda ended up increasing Southern racism. In 1990, Bill Clinton, under a new party called the Progressive Party, crushed George Wallace. The 1990s brought about a cultural and technological boom in North America, especially in the Pacific States, where the country was taking the lead in creating a new line of free entertainment in the city of Los Angeles. In 1994, the American Trade Union was formed between the CS, the PS, Kansas, Texas, and Arizona. Deseret and Colorado would join later. The late 1980s and early 1990s also saw the rise of a new form of worldwide connection between global computers called the Internet. Meanwhile, in China, after Chiang Kai-shek's death, the government liberalized, soon allowing elections to take place in the early 90s. This would eventually lead to them becoming a first world power in the 21st century. The new century brought about a new period of growth for North America and the world. The Pacific states were experiencing an economic boom. By 2003, their economy had become the biggest on the continent. China also rose to the top in Asia. Meanwhile, in Texas, the new president named George W. Bush was a hardline conservative and began imposing strict immigration and anti-drug trade laws, which began partially affecting the neighboring nations of Chihuahua and the Rio Grande Republic. Similar laws also began appearing in the Republic of Arizona. The drug cartels in these nations obviously didn't like this. On September 11, 2001, several bombs simultaneously exploded across the Texan capital in Austin, destroying several office and government buildings, including the Capitol. The cartel group immediately claimed responsibility, and President Bush was furious. In 2002, he promptly declared war on Rio Grande under the idea that the government had something to do with the 9/11 attack, thus beginning the Rio Grande War. Long story short, this war solved absolutely nothing, and only destroyed Rio Grande. Texan troops pulled out in 2009, leaving behind a third world country. The Texan economy also took a hit, and George W. Bush's image never recovered. Meanwhile, the American Union, run by the Silver Legion military junta, had declared a state of isolation and cut itself off from the rest of the world, becoming a tight surveillance state that would put Soviet Russia and Germany to shame. Nobody was allowed to leave the country, and foreigners were rarely allowed in, rules that still apply to this day. They also supposedly expanded their nuclear arsenal and continued to threaten the CSA and New England with total annihilation. In 2006, the American Union missile crisis began, where the Legion started testing more and more nuclear weapons, making the Confederate Central Intelligence Ministry extremely uneasy. The International Union quickly sanctioned the AU for this, as well as their allegations of crimes against humanity. In 2009, Japan and Thailand joined the Asian Unity Pact, further strengthening China's influence. Also throughout the 2000s, the internet saw great expansions, with the inventions of MyPage in 2004, YouTube in 2005, and Twitter in 2006. The Apple iPhone was also created in 2007. The Pacific states, as well as Cascadia, were taking the lead on these strides, while China was the nation helping to manufacture the new items. Also in Russia, the Russian Socialist Republic, or the RSR, began to open up to the world, as well as politically liberalize. Germany, meanwhile, became riddled with corruption and authoritarianism. Even though the Reich physically didn't exist, the basic ideological fundamentals were still very present. To this day, the country still has a very heavy police presence, both on the streets and on the internet, and information is still tightly controlled. All dissent is stamped out, militarization is promoted, and racist nationalism is still commonplace. This made Germany's neighbors, especially in Eastern Europe, very disgusted. Germany also received several EU sanctions between 2005 and 2011. 2014 was a big year. It marked the 30-year anniversary of Pacific States' independence and 40 years since the Liverpool Coffee Day. In 2015, the PSA launched their first major satellite and very soon took the lead in plans to make another moon landing and eventually even a Mars landing. The mid-2010s were also a time of deep unrest between Eastern Europe and Germany. In 2016, a series of demonstrations and protests took place demanding the German government to apologize for the Holocaust. The Germans refused, and anti-German sentiment grew. In 2019, a somewhat naval arms race began in the Pacific between the PSA and China, marking the beginning of a minor tension between the two powers. By the 2020s, North America had mostly recovered from the trauma of legionary rule. Technology was booming at a rate never seen before. After a narrow election against the incumbent Ron DeSantis, the CS elected their first female president in 2020 from the Progressive Party called Nikki Haley. Once in office, she majorly reformed the CS banking system. In 2021, the PS finally landed on the moon, with President Gavin Newsom calling it a milestone for the post-war Pacific states and all Americans. China did the same just 4 months ago back in June of this year, and finally, last year in 2022, due to rising amounts of political and economic stress as well as inflation, Texas held a referendum to decide whether or not to rejoin the Confederate States. They narrowly voted yes. And there we have it, a complete summary of history from 1860 to now. The current date as of making this video is the 11th of October 2023. The world is in a state of relative peace, however some economic tension is bubbling between the PSA and China, while various rogue states like the American Union and Germany continue to be a hindrance to their neighbors and the world. Next year, the CS is set to gain 3 new states. Some people wonder what could have happened for North America to not be this divided, and the answer lies mostly with the War of Secession. Many people have wondered if there is possibly an alternate universe out there where the North won the War of Secession and annexed the South back into the US. This has led to the writings of various alternate history books like Harry Turtledove's Northern Victory series. I'm even making a video series on the same topic. But in the end, we can never truly know, only speculate.